Welcome. Thank you all so much for attending. It's a miracle that we pulled it together, I can tell you. It's really great to see you all. So today Tom's going to be talking about all the experiments that show the correctness of MBT science. There's not going to be that much time for Q&A. There may be, but there'll be plenty of time for Q&A tomorrow. It's the softer side of MBT science that Tommy's going to be talking about tomorrow. So ladies and gentlemen, my niece is now going to open the event.
Hi everyone, welcome to MBT LA. My name is Ellie Peterson. Like Daghda said, I'm her niece. So in the first part of this century, neuroscientists interested in consciousness were told to watch out because this type of study was a CLM, a career-limiting move, punishable by ridicule from peers, loss of academic status, and possible loss of precious funding to continue research. Yet it is true that the great physicists of the 20th century knew that consciousness and physical matter were somehow interrelated, but they had no idea how. Stanford University experiments conducted over 30 years concluded that mind does in fact interact with matter. Unfortunately, they were unable to show the mechanics behind this discovery. They did not know that it is the mind that is able to move physical objects or predict certain outcomes. Knowing that it does is not enough for the extensive peer review necessary for a theory to become acceptable. You must demonstrate how it works. And so all those years of stringent and productive experiments meant nothing to mainstream science. Reality, we are told, is what we see before our eyes, and we are assured that there is absolutely no force or energy underpinning the universe. Reality, we are told, is objective and casual, which means that somehow physical reality produced itself out of itself. Scientists are so confident in the firmness of the foundation upon which they stand that a British professor is performing at stadium venues, assuring crowds of all ages that it really is particles all the way down. The notion of objective causality also leads to the enormous assumption that consciousness is an emanation of the brain. Consciousness hunters, including neuroscientists, who have been very busy for the past 10 years or so, searching in vain for the neural correlate that will reveal the whereabouts of this elusive beastie today, at a total loss to account for how it is that we are aware, and a rock, perhaps, is not. Some philosophers are actually saying that consciousness is a delusion, that it is nothing but a symptom or side effect of 1 trillion cells working in tandem to create the human body. And, this being true, we should abandon the search for consciousness altogether and move forward with what we have. Now, if we are not but mindless automatons who live and die, and that's the end of that, it is plain to see that there are some dark social engineering implications that could easily arise from this faulty logic. The long list of questions that science is unable to answer is quite remarkable. Yet we are being taught to put our hopes and trust in science and technology, which, we are told, will ultimately provide a streamlined global population with all of its needs, wants, and desires. Scientists are the keepers of these keys. They are the guardians and the disseminators of cosmologic information. We totally rely on them to tell us how the universe works. Their fixation with the belief that it really is particles all the way down is not only holding back the evolution of science, it is holding back the evolution of humankind. Thoughts and imagination, the drivers of what we say and do not enter into their limited equation, and so science is totally unable to account for this subjective phenomenon. This is a preposterous notion where science categorically shows that reality is in fact subjective and probabilistic. It is easy to see why a basic blueprint of reality has never been achieved, and why a host of questions, including who we are, where we come from, and why we are, have never manifested. Unfortunately for us, the new breed of rock star scientists are teaching me and other students of my age the heinous miscalculation of reality. If you kept on baking a cake that didn't rise, wouldn't you examine the recipe and perhaps experiment by switching ingredients until you perfected the perfect concoction? When you taste the pudding of mainstream science, you are left with a mouthful of particles that are so hard to chew, and especially those with the strong intuitive abilities are still left feeling hungry. These people set out in search of more nourishing tidbits, a tiny morsel that may help satiate their hunger for the truth and reality and meaning and the purpose of life. You guys found something. You found the morsel of truth in MBT, and I suspect that some of you have discovered that it is quite tasty indeed. There is no objective or subjective phenomenon that MBT theory does not account for. I've heard people say, but this can't be so, and even if it was, the drive behind our need to evolve would be dissolved. What would we have to live for if we knew everything? This perspective is rooted in the same undernourished soil that mainstream science is trying to grow from its toe form. MBT theory is a blueprint for reality. You can use it as a foundation to optimize your own functionality. It can also be applied to all the hard and soft sciences, to reposition them on a platform of truth, so that rather than being stuck in the unknown, they can at last evolve from the limiting Newtonian concept of objective causality. As science has been belief blinded, so have we all. Blinded by cultural and personal belief structures that cause a great deal of pain and suffering. They need careful dismantling so that we can at last see the truth. Isn't that all that we wanted? There is a lot to do. Tom's intent is that the overall model of reality described by the My Big Toe trilogy should be a model that you can apply. It should be practical as well as theoretical. Its primary usefulness lies in its ability to help you meet and solve some of your most daunting professional and personal challenges. Secondly, it provides a logical, unified theoretical understanding of the reality of which you are a part. If you are a scientist or a philosopher, it is the secondary usefulness that will seem the most important. It is not. MBT theory can also be applied to your life. You can use the blueprint to upgrade yourself by dismantling beliefs that have been installed by yourself and the culture that you are a part of. Plato once said that an unexamined life was not worth living. It is true that without reflection, you cannot initiate the necessary methods, procedures, or protocols necessary to upgrade your models, and a model that is not open-ended can never be added to, so your mindset becomes transfixed and unable to evolve. Without contemplation, how are you going to examine the feedback you get, which is necessary to make upgrades and facilitate an expression of personal awareness? And the more you see, the more you are able to see, growing your own toe, increasing your own functionality, learning how to work the controls of your own mind and its primary importance. The single most important derivation of MBT theory is that Tom has scientifically shown why it is that cooperation, compassion, and love are absolutely necessary for the continuation of our species and of our planet. Without love in the equation, there can be no evolution. By the end of these 2 days, I do hope that you all become more aware of why it is a scientific fact that love is the answer. I have the pleasure of introducing the only scientist worth rock star status. The author of the only big toe we will ever have for a very long time. He is no ordinary egghead. He has no ivory tower. He treads the boards for no pay. He is taking this groundbreaking theory to the people of the world by embarking on the 2017 Cultural Connection World Tour. MBTLA is a precursor to that historic event. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Campbell.
Thank you, Ellie. That was no doubt the best introduction I've ever received anywhere. Particularly from the mouth of someone so young. I mean, that's wonderful. I've had some people, some young man who was as young as 13 attend these talks that I give, and I've had a smattering of teens now and then. But generally, the audience is, somewhere between, 30 and 65. We don't have a lot of real young people that are yet interested in the nature of reality. They have too many other pressing matters to deal with in their life. So, Elliot makes me smile, and I feel really good about you being here and the introduction that you gave. Thank you very much. It was terrific. First off, a list of the people who need to be thanked for making this event happen. Of course, at the bottom of my list, this list that was made by Daghda, at the bottom of my list is Daghda MacCuolahan, and she was the one who envisioned it. She was the one who made it happen. She was the one who probably shed the most tears and blood, to get it to happen. She had a lot of hardship to go through to get here, and I really appreciate Daghda putting all this together. We also have Alex Peterson, James Joyce, Justin Snodgrass, Marla Fries, and Donna Aveni, all people who put effort and time into making this a success. So thank you all, or we wouldn't be here doing this if it wasn't for them. All right, I'm calling this talk Reality 102, Why 102? Well, because I already had a talk I called Reality 101, and it's just not good to name two talks the same name. It makes people confused. So this is Reality 102. This is going to be a little different than what I normally do. Typically in these workshops, I start at the beginning and kind of derive what reality is all about, why it's that way. If you've looked at the Calgary workshop, or you've looked at the one that I did, the last one was in Marseille, that's up on YouTube, that's where you'll find really the theory of MBT. I'm not going to do that today. I have something else for you today. And if you find that you don't have the logical connections between things, because I'm not going to start in the beginning and derive everything. I'm going to start somewhere in the middle, and I won't be going through the details because I've done that over and over and over. It's out there, it's available. So anything I tell you that you say, oh, how did he get to that point? You know, did he just make that up? Well, I'm not making it up. There's really logic behind my points, and you can find that elsewhere, but you probably won't find it today. But you can ask the question either later on today or tomorrow if you have issues and things and you don't know how I got from A to B. So we'll have lots of time for Q&A tomorrow, and depending on how quickly I can get through these slides, there's about 60 of them that we're going to do today. We may have some Q&A for today. I hope so. Well, I'll give you just a very short background because most of you have probably heard that already too. I'm a physicist. I met Bob Monroe when I was in my late 20s. Bob was looking for scientists to work in his lab. I was a scientist and I volunteered. And the deal was that he would teach me to do what he knew how to do, which, if you know Bob Monroe, that's journeys out of the body, far journeys, and yeah, what? Ultimate Journey, right, his three books. So he taught me how to get into this larger consciousness system and explore it and do that whenever I chose to do that under complete control. So I'm a physicist, and what physicists do is try to understand how reality works. Well, that was a big challenge to a physicist who was now, flying around in the larger reality as to how does this thing work? What are the limits? What can I do? What does it mean? What is consciousness anyway? And those were all hard questions, and I'm a little bit slow. So it was about 30, 35 years later that I wrote these books. And I'd been working on it pretty much all that time. The Monroe connection lasted a decade or so, probably 5 years that were really active all the time, and then as a board of directors for years after that. But anyway, I never let it go. Once you start down this path, most of you have found, you don't turn around and walk away from it. This is a path of becoming, a path of growing up. And once on it, you kind of take wherever it, you go wherever it takes you. So that's what I did. I kept working on it. And I knew by the time I got to where I was writing the books, and the books took about 5 years to write, I understood consciousness, I thought, pretty well. I understood that this is a virtual reality. That means it's a computed reality. I understood that consciousness was the computer. I understood that in a social system that consciousness is, with all of us individuated units of consciousness, that's us, bouncing around in this larger consciousness system, that it's a social system, which led to the conclusion that to lower entropy, now I'm skipping steps here a little bit, but to lower entropy, that means for a information system, lowering entropy means evolving, existing, continuing. Randomness in an information system means no information. To an information system, that's death, disappearing, dissolving. Okay? So this system is just a natural system, and it wants to survive, it wants to evolve, it's aware. It's conscious. Well, it's consciousness. Of course it's conscious. It's intelligent. It's conscious. So in order to evolve, it has to lower entropy. And the lowest entropy state in a cooperative environment full of individuated unit of consciousness is if they cooperate, if they care about each other, if they have compassion. That means that love is the point of our existence. Okay, so I knew all that. And I knew that that was a very important message to get across, that was kind of dramatic. Here we are. What's our purpose? Who are we? Why are we here? Well, we're here to grow up. We're here to lower the entropy of our consciousness. We're here to become love. And certainly the world needs that message. That's pretty obvious. We don't live in that world yet, that world of love. But we need to. Interesting enough, I didn't really realize what good physics, understanding consciousness, would create. I didn't understand that until about 2 years in. I published these books in 2003. And a couple of years after that, I got the idea, and I came to the conclusion that the same principles that explain consciousness explained physics. And I saw that my probabilistic model of consciousness was the perfect explanation for quantum mechanics and how the double slit experiment works. And the double slit experiment is like the quintessential quantum mechanics experiment. It's not that hard, and it shows you, has all the stuff of what's strange about quantum mechanics. It's all wrapped up in that one experiment. Matter of fact, quantum physicist Richard Feynman had said that the double slit experiment, if we understood that, all the rest, would be clear. That's the key thing. So when I realized that I understood that from the consciousness viewpoint, I started looking at other things. And it wasn't but a few months went by that I saw also that consciousness told me why c was a constant. Speed of light, c. It's another big mystery in science. And then I started looking for other things, and I started finding that the paradigm, the paradoxes in science, physics has a lot of paradoxes, things it just doesn't understand. They have experiments that give them data, but they just don't know why it's like that. That consciousness was explaining all of these paradoxes, one after the other after the other. And the very last thing that I've added to the list is chaos theory. I read a book about chaos, and the author wrote in this book, he said that scientists and science historians have made the comment that the 20th century would be known for three things, three big things that science accomplished or that science discovered in the 20th century. Quantum mechanics, relativity, and chaos. Well, consciousness had explained quantum mechanics, then explained relativity with the speed of light being constant. So I thought, chaos, let me think about that for a minute, and it also explains that. There's a very rational, I'll get to that toward the end of the talk. I'll explain a little bit about why our reality is chaotic. Now, I don't mean chaos in the terms of what you see on the street. I mean chaos in the terms of more like physics, in the terms of the way systems work and systems move. We find a lot of natural systems are naturally chaotic if you push them into areas that are unstable. So that became in the 1990s, I guess. Original work maybe goes all the way back to the 70s, but it really became a big thing in the 1990s. It's the last kind of big idea that we had about the nature of reality. Fundamentally, it's chaotic. It's not buttoned down like we thought or like we pretend. So we'll talk about that. So the point was, how was I going to deliver this message of love to the larger population? And it occurred to me that the key, of course, is virtual reality. That was my key. Once I understood that this was a virtual reality and it was all information-based, everything else, all the rest of the dominoes, were in line. They all toppled over, and everything made sense. So virtual reality, understanding that is the key thing, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. And as Ellie told us, the scientists seem to just not get that. They had an experiment back in the early 1920s, almost 100 years ago, that told them that reality was not materialistic. Told them it was probabilistic. It told them that consciousness was involved because certain things happened when there was an observer that didn't happen if there wasn't an observer. So they had this information, but they didn't know what to do with it. So mostly they ignored it and pretended that it didn't exist, called it weird science, and went on. Okay? So that, to me, this double slit experiment was what I call a minor miracle, right? A miracle is something that happens that shouldn't, something you can't explain. It's a thing that is beyond your explanation. Well, the double slit experiment was a minor miracle because it just shouldn't happen. You know, the double slit experiment says that if you fire particles one at a time at two holes in a background, those particles won't just pile up behind each hole, they will distribute themselves in a wave pattern. It's called a diffraction pattern. For some reason, they'll go through this hole and then find some place on the screen they hit that's a diffraction pattern. Well, that to me is sort of a miracle. You can't explain that. But it's a minor miracle because the particles are little. They're so tiny that scientists could say, well, they're so small we can't see them, so we don't really know the mechanism there. It's just weird science. It was easier to brush off. So what we needed was a major miracle. Even a couple of major miracles would be better. We needed something that showed these same things about virtual reality, but with hard chunks of matter that you could hold in your hand and look at, right? Things that you could do that would demonstrate that this was indeed a virtual reality and that it indeed was information-based and that consciousness is indeed the computer. So I started looking for those. And this is probably about a year or two ago, a couple of years ago, and I came up with a few, but the time wasn't right yet. Because when I started this in the early 2000s, 2003, me and maybe 5 other people on the planet thought virtual reality was a good idea. Everybody else thought it was silly. Now, 13 years later, virtual reality is taken very seriously. And most of that happened just in the last 5 years. It went from silly to this is the answer. And physicists didn't come there easily. They got drugged there, kicking and screaming, by the results of their own experiments. That's how they got there. And the younger crowd that wasn't quite as dedicated to the old way of looking at things started saying, yeah, this looks like a virtual reality. It's information-based. But that's as far as they got. It's like, well, okay, so what's the next step? And there was no next step because they didn't have any fundamental theory in which to put that into some kind of context where it made any sense. It seemed to be another piece of strange physics. It was there, but didn't make any sense. Well, I think we've got to the point now that there's enough support behind virtual reality that people will take concepts of virtual reality seriously. So it's time for me to talk about these experiments because I wanted to wait until at least there was a good chance that people would say, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, virtual reality. Let's try these and see how they work, which 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. It would have been virtual reality experiments. Go away. Don't waste my time. But this is a different world now, just in the past 5 years. So what I'm going to show you today, by the time we get to the end of this, I'm going to show you 3 major miracles. I'm going to show you experiments that will be impossible to do without a miracle. They're impossible to do under the understanding of materialism. And they're not tiny little particles. They're things you can hold in your hand. These are macro things that you can hold in your hand. So if they work the way I think they will work, then it will be a very big deal. Now, why this is important is not so much the physics. The physics is just the lever. It's the lever to pry the ball out of its rut and to get it rolling. Because you see, the first step in getting there is to get the physicist on board. And as you've heard me term the scientists today, the new high priests of Western culture, and Western culture now is world culture. It's pretty well spread everywhere. That was the culture that Ellie was telling us about that looks the other way and doesn't have the answers. Okay. So the scientists are the new high priests. They tell us what to believe. They tell us what is truth and what is false. They tell us what is superstition and what is fact. That's the role that scientists have, and they have their scientific method to do that. You see? So without the scientists standing up and saying, this is a virtual reality and here's how it works, virtual reality ideas will always be in the margins. They'll never be mainstream. And without the understanding of virtual reality, there's no understanding that consciousness is the computer. Without that understanding that consciousness is the computer, you don't end up with love is the answer. Because only when you understand the nature of consciousness do you see that we are here to evolve and that love is the answer. So if we really want this idea that love is the answer to spread and be seen by the masses, then we start with the physicists. That's the lever that will get the ball rolling. Seems odd, doesn't it, that you start with physicists, the group that is probably the furthest away and deepest in denial, about this, but that's the group you have to start with to get this ball rolling. Otherwise, the ball just wobbles around in the margins and it'll stay there. It's been in the margins, since Buddha said our reality is an illusion. Well, he was right on, but it didn't really cause much to happen other than in the margins. So that's where we are. So these physics experiments, hopefully, will be miracle enough to get the scientists interested in proving them wrong and doing them and hopefully showing that it actually works that way. So what I've done is I've taken a concept of virtual reality, how that virtual reality applies to our reality, how our reality is created from this virtual reality, and taken those concepts and just applied them to quantum mechanics. Okay, so how would the larger consciousness system run this reality? How do they implement it? How does it work? And one of the last big ideas that I had there, that kind of was the last chink in the logical process, I actually had here in California, in Southern California, just probably 50 miles south. I think it was Costa Mesa, where I did a workshop, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? I don't know. It was a long time. 8 years ago. Okay, 8 years ago. And when I was there talking, I had answered some questions and was having a little conversation later with my son, who lives in that neighborhood, and he attended it, and he said, well, don't you think I was mentioning things that the probability, the most likely thing was chosen. What was most likely was the thing that was chosen because we had all the likelihoods. And he said, well, wouldn't that better if it was random? And I thought, well, yeah, that's sort of what I meant, but because of the way the randomness works out, you end up most of the time with what's most likely. But that got me thinking about more definition to the structure. And from that point forward, it all went very quickly to where I understood the mechanism of how this reality operates. And it's that understanding that is going to produce these experiments. Now, these are just experiments, so we don't know how they're going to work out yet. We don't know what the result's going to be. Virtual reality, my concept of virtual reality and how it works is what leads to them. Whether that actually turns out to be correct, you have to wait for the experiments to be done. If it's not correct, well, the ideas about consciousness and about love is the answer, and that this is a virtual reality still are good. Doesn't throw those out. It would just mean that my understanding of how that virtual reality implements, the mechanics of how that implements this reality, were wrong. Okay? So that's what we're going to do today. Hopefully, this will be the kickoff to a major sea-state change in the thinking of science about virtual reality and consciousness. So that's what we're here to do today. And for those of you who are mostly right-brained and deal with big pictures in the whole world, I'll apologize ahead of time. This is going to be mostly technical. It's going to be on a level that everybody can understand. I'm not going to talk physics speak, but it's going to be long, and it's going to be about virtual reality and science and physics. And hopefully you'll find it interesting, because I think it'll help you see how the bigger picture is put together. But if it's really too painful, I hope you brought your Excedrin with you, and particularly Marla. Last time I talked to Marla, she was in that group that I talked about down in Costa Mesa. And she came up to me about 2/3 of the way through, and she says, "Tom, you have given me the worst headache." Says, "I'm trying to get my mind around all of these things, and it's just, my brain's going to explode."
But she's still here.
And she's still here. Came back for more. So that's kind of what we're doing, why we're here, and what we're going to talk about. The neat thing here is that this progression from virtual reality to consciousness to computer to love is the answer is not steps that take any leaps. No leaps in logic, no leaps of faith. Once you get virtual reality, consciousness to computer is just a logical deduction. And once you get consciousness system is the most fundamental system and kind of behind it all, then the idea that love is the answer is just logical deduction. It's just not that hard to get there. So if we get this first step, you see, those other steps will be resisted mightily, but they're so obvious that they will fall, I think, rather quickly. So anyway, that's what we're doing. This may be something that will make a big difference. We hope so. All right. I've got, you see I have a lot of slides there on the physics experiments, the 35 or 45 slides, and that's because a lot of my slides are for the reader later on. Some of them will be in 10-point type, right? You couldn't read them even if you were standing, right up against the screen, because the screen probably doesn't resolve things that well. But when this gets presented, these slides will be just like reading a Word document on your computer. It'll all be perfectly readable. For those of you that want to hear more, the details I'm not really going to talk about. All the right-brainers just went, phew, that's good to hear. So I'm not going to drag you through all the details. That would take a couple of days. You can get that yourself. I'm just going to do the introductions, what they are, how they're going to work, and why, what the miracle is that we're going to try to pull off here. See, the problem with this is that I got a lot of criticism early on about being falsifiable. In science, if you're not falsifiable, you're not science. Falsifiable means there has to be some way to prove you're wrong in order for it to really be right. You see? So it's kind of the opposite of saying that it has to be verifiable. Okay? So if you say things that aren't falsifiable, like reality is created by pink elephants that fly about at night, nobody can see them and they're invisible. You see, it's not falsifiable. Nobody can prove that because they're invisible and nobody can ever see them. You see, it's almost as crazy as saying that things like electric fields exist. That's in about the same category as the elephants, but we'll get to that later. Anyhow, The problem is that you have to be falsifiable in a physics viewpoint. You have to have a physical experiment that shows, can verify what you're saying, or that could possibly show that what you're saying is wrong. Well, if what you're saying is that consciousness is fundamental and everything's derived from consciousness, and by the nature of virtual reality, consciousness has to be non-physical. This is a virtual reality. And you'll see that logic that'll tell you that consciousness has to be non-physical. How do you have a physical experiment that shows you the non-physical? Oh, that's tough. See, that's a tough one to do. This idea of falsifiability only really applies to the physical world. So when you talk about what's behind the curtain, the consciousness, well, you need a physical experiment that will point to something that's non-physical. That's what's so tough. But that's exactly what the double slit experiment did. So that's why I started with double slit experiments, because they're simple and they have the ability to point to something that's beyond the physical. So that's the idea. All right, virtual reality. We'll go on to that. The thesis is our virtual reality, what we call physical universe, is generated by an intelligent, probability-based simulation, not a deterministic, matter-based, bottoms-up process. It's particles all the way down. That's the bottoms-up process. You start with tiny little things and you build up this world out of those. Okay, and we're going to look at some easily achievable quantum mechanics experiments that can verify or falsify this thesis. Okay, you're going to see this little EV on a lot of slides. Those are things that are experimentally verifiable. And this whole thesis is going to be experimentally verifiable. If these things work, that's going to be the only conclusion that'll make sense. Which doesn't mean it'll be accepted right away, but it'll be the only one that makes sense, and that raises the probability it'll be accepted. Okay, these slides are going to be busy. You don't really have to read them all or pay attention to them. I'll tell you everything about them you really need to know, so if you can't see them very well or if you can't read them, the slides are really meant for the people who are going to get this on a DVD or from YouTube and sit down and read it at their computer. So I put way more words on them because these people won't be at this talk. They won't have the benefit of hearing me. Slides have to contain all the information, so they're very busy. They're not like the typical kind of slides that you're going to see. They're going to have a lot more information on them. Okay. So this is just kind of background. This is a little bit of background, and we'll do that very quickly. We start with the assumption that primordial consciousness exists, then it evolved to become what it is today, and it's still evolving. Okay, that's kind of just an assumption where we start here. Conjecture. That is that the larger consciousness system evolves through emergent complexity, operating on simple, initially random, recursive processes. Okay, I won't spend a lot of time on that. I've talked about that and other things, but the idea is there's a science called emergent complexity that says if you have a random system that has the potential to be more than a random system, it will, over time, actualize that potential. It's just a matter if you wait long enough, a lot of the combinations of things will happen and will produce something that isn't random. And if that something is stable, you can build on it. And that not random thing can become something that persists. And the idea about cellular automata is it's a concept that takes a very simple process, just a little 2 or 3 line process, and you just keep repeating that process and repeating that process. And by doing that, you can create huge, complex, sophisticated results. And why does that work? Well, people don't know that yet, but a cellular automata is what I call a process fractal. You know about fractals. Fractal, you can take, say, a triangle and then put smaller triangles on the sides of the bigger triangle and then put smaller yet triangles on the side of that. And then this whole thing has a shape of some other kind of triangle, and you just keep adding. It's triangles, all the way up, I suspect. And you keep building this thing, and you end up with these elaborate, often beautiful designs that have no end. They just keep building and growing, and they would go on for as long as you want to put the computer time to crank them out. So they're unending. Okay, that's what fractals do. Well, that's because you take, and they're called geometric fractals, because you take a little geometric equation and you just reiterate it around and around and around on itself. Output feeds the input. This is a process fractal. We have a process. Evolution is a process. These cellular automata are processes, and they work the same way. The output of the process becomes the input to the next cycle of that process. So the output keeps feeding, turns into the input, which produces a new output, which then goes into that same process, which produces a new output. So it just keeps building on itself. And when you have things that build on themselves like that, they grow and grow and grow, and they get really complex and often beautiful. And our world is built up out of these fractal processes. This is a fractal reality because it's driven by evolution, and evolution is a process fractal. So that's how we get all this. If you wonder why this world, it started with a couple of cells and it ends up with all of this, that's how fractals work. They build upon themselves. So once you understand the fractal nature of reality, and that this is a fractal, a process fractal, not a geometric fractal, then it's no wonder how it can build. So we have these cellular automata, which are really process fractals. And they can build and build and build, and it gets very, very complex. So that's our core idea of, well, where did this conscious system come from anyway? It came from potential. Randomly, that potential pulled itself together, called emergent complexity, which is mathematically sound. And the complexity came up with a rule set that was stable, and the rule set began to iterate on itself, and eventually you end up with a very complex system. Somewhere in there, it became self-aware. Okay, now that's the magic you pull out of the hat. Somewhere, somehow, it became self-aware. Well, that's why we start with this as an assumption. There's no real way to say just how that happened, other than complexity makes that possible. Okay, so that's why I call it conjecture, because you need a starting point, and that's where we start. So, as I mentioned, the point of an information system, consciousness is an information system. It's just about data. That's what consciousness does. It's aware. It has data. It has perception. So lowering entropy is the driving force of this thing. That's the purpose. That's why it works. That's why it's there. That's what keeps it alive. Okay, then the need of the larger conscious system evolution eventually leads to the evolution of this virtual reality that we're in. And it's really a entropy reduction trainer for us. We're here as pieces of consciousness in this virtual reality reduction trainer, if you will, which means we're here to grow up and become love. Lower our entropy, which lowers the entropy of the whole system. All right? That happens because we start this VR with a rule set and initial conditions. For those of you who have heard my other talks, I'm just kind of speeding through it. I've just gone through about 6 hours worth of detail here, but hang with me. We start this virtual reality as a simulation, just like any other simulation in a computer. And we have initial conditions, and we have a rule set, how things can change. And you punch the run button, and when you do, things change. Well, we started with the initial conditions were this tight little ball of plasma under very high pressure, very high temperature, and it went bang in a big way. So they call that the Big Bang, except instead of this Big Bang being a physical thing, this Big Bang was a simulation. And from then on, it evolved according to the rule set. Okay, so that's how the thing started. It started out mainly as deterministic calculations because the rule set's mostly deterministic with a little bit of probability because natural functions are sometimes random. But then eventually, as experience and it evolves, things begin to repeat themselves. Things become self-similar. And calculating everything from the bottoms up with a rule set becomes tedious. So you start to talk about letting the rule set create the probability distributions that now more effectively, from a computer science point, will run the output of your virtual reality. And we'll explain that in a little bit. I'm just kind of giving you a big overall picture, so when I breeze through some of the other things, it'll all fall together. Okay, so that's what it's all about. An overview. I explained virtual reality this way, and I think it's probably the easiest to understand. All virtual realities have some of the same principles, right? There's a set of ideas and concepts that are just virtual reality. And every virtual reality that you can conceive of now or ever will have these basic things because that's just the nature of a virtual reality. Okay? So the virtual reality that you get in The Sims or in a flight trainer, right? Pilots learn how to fly planes on computers before they actually get into something that costs, $500,000 and fly it around. They learn in computers, flight simulators. This is virtual reality. Okay? All virtual realities have these same attributes. There are three things that are interacting. Well, actually two things that are interacting and one is a result. The two things that are interacting are one, there's a computer. Okay? That's where the rule set is used. Two, there is a player. The guy learning how to fly the plane, or you playing your elf in World of Warcraft. Okay? And the third thing is the actual computation of the virtual reality itself. But that's not really an active thing. That's the result. Now, how do these two active components work? Well, the player and the computer are in a constant dialogue. The computer says, elf, stand up, because the player types that in. He hits the stand up command or whatever you have to do to make your elf stand up. That goes to the computer. The computer takes that command and changes the pixels on that person's computer screen so when they look at it, they see their elf standing up. And if that has any consequences, it computes those too. Like maybe when the elf stands up, he bumps his head on something above him. All the consequences of that, he can see different things standing up than he could down. So there's a lot of consequences of those actions, and it computes all the consequences of the action that the player sent in. Okay? All virtualities work that way. Now, one of the interesting things is that from the elf's viewpoint, the computer has to be non-physical. From the elf's viewpoint, what's physical is the World of Warcraft map. Right? That's physical in his world. That's what he deals with. If he runs into a brick wall there, it hurts, or falls off a cliff, it hurts. He can set things down on tables and they just stay there. They don't fall through the tables. It's a virtual table and a virtual elf and a virtual thing that he's setting on that virtual table, but it's solid and he can bang his fist on it, just like we can here, you see. But that's because of the rule set. That's the way the rule set works. Okay, so the player says, elf, stand up. The computer says, okay, I'll do that and calculate all the consequences. And the computer then sends the data back to the player, displayed on the player's screen. The screener the player looks at it, sees the elf stand up, and sees the consequences, which then the player can react to those consequences and tell the computer something else. So it's really a conversation between the player and the computer. That's it. The actual virtual reality is just data on a hard drive someplace. That's all it is. Now, our reality is just like that. Okay? All virtual realities are like that. So that means that this being a virtual reality, who are we? We're the player, not our physical bodies. Our physical bodies, just like the elf. We, our consciousness, us as an individuated unit of consciousness, is the player. Okay? And that consciousness has to be non-physical to the virtual reality. That's just the way it is. We, as a player of World of Warcraft, we're sitting with our computer. We're not in that reality that the elf's in. We are not there, you see. We are non-physical to that. And so must the computer be non-physical to that. The computer can't be part of the elf's reality either, because that has to be separate from what it renders. It's not rendering itself, you see. So the virtual reality paradigm says the virtual reality is just data in a computer. The consciousness and the computer, the player and the computer, are non-physical to the view from inside the virtual reality. Well, now we translate that to us. So here we are, we're consciousness. So the computer has to be in our reality as consciousness. The computer also has to be consciousness. The computer and the player have to be in the same reality. They're communicating all the time. So when you play World of Warcraft, you and your computer have to share a reality, because you can't communicate like that across, reality frames. So the computer has to be consciousness. See, obvious, it's not really hard logic. If this is a virtual reality, we're the player. Consciousness has to be the computer as well, since consciousness is the player. All right, so that's the way the system works. Let's see if I missed anything here. The very last thing is the way the computer decides what to put on the screen is that it looks at all the possibilities. There's an action. So the player is going to make a measurement. That means ask for some data. Look someplace. Do something. Take an action. So you look over here. That's making a measurement. Now I have to get data telling me what's over there. And I look over here, I get data telling me what's over there. So my world is created by a data stream from the computer, which is consciousness. That's a hard thing for most people to understand. And they think, well, that means when I don't look, it disappears. That's not really the right way to say that. It means when you don't look, it never was there in the first place. It was just data in a data stream. You see, it's not that when I look away, it somehow goes poof. It's that it wasn't there when I was looking at it. It's just data in a data stream that I interpret as that. Okay, what about your elf? When he looks to the mountains in the east in the World of Warcraft game, does the river in the west disappear? There never was a river in the west. It's just the virtual reality. It's just information. When he's getting this information, he's not getting that information because he doesn't have eyes in the back of his head. So he only gets the data stream that's pertinent. That's how that works. It's not that this is a magic world where things disappear when we don't look at them. The things were never really there. It's just data in a computer. Okay, so the way it works is that when you make a measurement, and this is a key idea, you ask for data. The computer sends you the data that's what's there, right? And what it can send you is constrained by two things. It has to be according to the rule set. You're not going to get data that doesn't fit the rule set. And the other thing is it has to abide by whatever's gone by in the past. It has to be consistent with what was there the last time you looked. You see? So those are its constraints. Within those constraints, there may be 10 things that could be there. And if there's a lot of uncertainty about it, there may be 100 things. If there's very little uncertainty, there only be one thing. Because I just looked there, I saw doors, I'm going to look there again. Well, there's going to be doors. You see, that's a probability of 1. Because history says that's where the doors are. So it looks at all the possibilities, puts those in a probability distribution. 10 possibilities of what I might see, and here's the probability of number 1, and probability of number 2, and number 3. Oh, big probability there, and then little other probabilities. And it'll go in and just randomly draw out of that probability distribution. And I'll explain a little bit just what that means. When it randomly draws out of that probability distribution, it doesn't mean it just randomly picks one of those things to happen. It's actually a random draw from a probability distribution, which I'll explain later. And that is what you see. So now if you look at something that's unknown, there are a lot of things in the probability distribution that you might get. If you look at things that don't have much uncertainty, like that door being over there, then there's only one thing in that probability distribution, and that's that, because history puts it there, see? So that's the way the reality works. And this random draw from the probability distribution is a key idea. And anybody who'd like to get a better sense of this, I encourage you to go look up a new computer game called No Man's Sky. It's based on what's called procedural programming, which is very similar to the way our reality is programmed. And you will see how this works, because the description of No Man's Sky, when you read about it and it tells you how they do it, will sound a whole lot like the description that I've just told you. Everything's computed on the fly. Nothing's saved in memory. It's not that the computer has to save a picture of that door for me. Everything is computed on the fly. Okay, so that's the way it works. Now, the virtual reality has to be predominantly probabilistic. And I'll give you a little demonstration of that. It starts out mostly deterministic, but then progressively becomes more probabilistic. And the deterministic part is what actually calculates the distributions for the probability part. Now, I've used this idea of a cannon, and you've probably heard me say this before, but it's a really good example because it's so simple. A cannon is one of the simplest machines ever, right? It's a piece of metal with a hole in it, and you put powder in the back, roll a ball in, and light it, and pressure builds behind the ball, and it goes out, and the ball lands someplace. It's so simple. Okay. If you were to describe a cannon shooting deterministically, you'd have to start at least at the molecular level, if not at the atomic level, to describe it. You'd have all these little particles that you'd have to start with. Because when you light that powder behind that ball, the way that powder burns has lots of variable. How it's packed, its density, where the air is, how much oxygen is there. When this part burns, then it changes the environment immediately before the next part burns, and it's a very complex process. And if you do that at the molecular level, it would take a supercomputer months just to solve the problem of firing one cannonball out of a cannon. Because that ball is not perfectly round, that barrel is not a perfect cylinder. As that ball comes out, that barrel actually warps, it flaps a little bit, metal has elasticity, it heats up. As soon as it heats up, all the dimensions change. You see, it's a very complicated problem. In a bottoms-up, particles all the way down kind of a reality, that's what you have to do. Everything has to be calculated from quarks to cannonballs. You got to start at the simple things because you don't really have to start at, or shouldn't start at molecules. Molecules, are made of smaller parts. Atoms, and those atoms are made of smaller parts. And even those smaller parts are made of smaller parts. And you have to start at the bottom, if it's particles all the way down, and you have to compute this cannonball going out of the cannon. It's almost an impossible problem. I doubt that physicists could even compute it very accurately, okay? Or very precisely, I should say. Something in the 7th or 8th decimal place probably is too hard to do. So how do you describe this? You describe it with probability. I have this cannon, and when I fire it, the ball goes out about like this and lands about over there. and I have a probability distribution. It might land here, it might land there, someplace else, and real cannons are like that. If you lock a cannon down, cement it in place, and fire it 100 times, probably the ball will never land in the same place twice because of all these variables that I'm talking about. Well, you describe that with a probability distribution. And now when you want to fire that cannon, say, well, where's the ball going to go? Well, you've got all these possibilities where it might land, and you take a random draw, and that's where they'll put it. See? Now you've taken a problem that from the ground up, a supercomputer and a team of physicists probably couldn't solve in 5 years, to a random draw from a probability distribution that takes less than a nanosecond in today's computer. You see, you've really simplified the problem a lot. And if you really had to compute this thing from the bottoms up, it would be an impossible job. You can't compute from the bottoms up. It's too complicated. And reality doesn't work that way. So the larger consciousness system computing this reality isn't going to be a deterministic system. That doesn't make any sense. That's not parsimonious in computer terms. That's hugely wasteful. When it can do it once or twice or even 1,000 times, it can do it deterministically to whatever level of accuracy is required, no more. And from those samples, it can create probability distributions. And from then on, nanosecond per shot. You see, it's just that easy. So that's why it has to be a probabilistic reality. The bottoms up just doesn't work. So the rule set is deterministic, and it is what creates that. Well, how's the larger conscious system going to run that program that creates these probabilities? Well, remember, it's a virtual cannon with a virtual cannonball and virtual gunpowder, and all of it's virtual. And the only reason you see it there is because it's already been calculated. It's been modeled by the larger consciousness system, or you wouldn't see it there. And all those processes have been modeled, or it wouldn't have been built. The logic to build it wouldn't have been there. So it's got everything it needs to run those calculations and produce the probability distributions. That's why virtual reality is probabilistic. It just makes good sense. All right, one more. All right, we're going to talk about virtual reality and physics. This hopefully won't take long. Here's a couple of examples of the interface now between the virtual reality and physics. So I've just told you about virtual reality, and if we take these concepts that I just said, okay, we start to see a lot of things. One of the things that surprises physicists that if you have a particle like an electron, it has spin. Now, don't think of a little thing spinning around, because that's not what's going on. Spin is a metaphor for something that is not physical. Well, how do we have these physical particles that have to be described with non-physical attributes? But anyway, so we have a spin. And every time they measure that particle's spin, it's random whether it's spin up or spin down. Spin comes in discrete things. It's up or down. You don't get cockeyed spins. They're always up and down, because this is quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics has certain states you can be in and other states you can't. So always random. Why is that? Why isn't it always the same thing? Why don't you measure it once, it's up, and the next time it's up, and then the next time it's down, and it's just random? You know, it's like, why is that? Well, scientists don't know. Well, it's easy. It's a random draw from the probabilities. The probabilities is it can be up or down. It's random because when you take a random draw, you know, you get a random result. That's real simple. That same random draw is going to be, we're going to show you later, is the root of the chaos theory. There's a Zeno effect. The Zeno effect in physics is an effect where if you have let's say an atom in a quantum state, you have, it can be in, say, state A, B, C, or D. So this atom has, let's say, those 4 states that it can be in. Okay? And we have it in state, we measure it, it's in state A. And it takes that atom roughly, say, a minute. I'm just making these things up to make it easy for you to comprehend it. Let's say it takes a minute for that atom to decay to one of the other states. It'll go from A to B or C or D, or you can pump up energy and maybe get it up to A, but it's a state that's going to decay. Well, if it takes a minute for that state to typically decay, again, that's a probability. The minute is the average time it takes for it to decay. You measure it 10 minutes later, it'll be in some other state. And 10 minutes later, some other state. But if you measure it 10 seconds later, it's going to be in the same state. Because it hadn't had time to decay yet, right? And you measure it 10 seconds later, it'll be in the same state. And keep doing that. And an hour later, if you keep doing that, it's still in the same state. It never decays. You see? Well, why doesn't it decay? Well, because every time when you've just measured it, it hasn't had time to decay, you go and say, well, what state could it be in? Well, the probability that it's in B or C or D is almost zero. It's only been 10 seconds since the last time you measured it. So the probability it's going to be in A is almost 1. And when you take a draw out of that probability distribution, you're always going to get the same answer. It's in A. That resets the clock. Now you got to wait for another minute. You see? But so if you do this, that was a paradox that says, why is it if I keep measuring the state, it never decays? I can stop the decay of a particle just by measuring it a lot. So that explains why. It's that random draw. Entanglement. We've all heard about entanglement. You know, the big experiment where you flip a spin state here, and a billion miles away, a spin state flips the opposite way someplace else, and it happens instantaneously. This is an information system. That's an if-then statement. If this flips, that flips. It's real simple in a computer system to do that. They're all part of the same thing. They're connected in an if-then statement. All right. Space, time, mass, charge, gravitation, and spin. These are all the fundamentals of physics. Everything else in physics is made up of these things. Right? These are the basic fundamentals of science. Everything is in terms of these few things: space, time, mass, charge, gravitation, and spin. And maybe I've neglected something, but a very small list of things that are at the bottom of the pile that are fundamental. You ask any physicist, well, where do those things come from? Where's mass come from? Where's the spin come from? Where do we get this weird spin? How is it made? Where's space come from? Well, we've got an expanding universe, right? The universe keeps getting bigger and bigger. What happens? How's that extra space made to put in the universe? And what was it we expanded into? You see, we have all of these questions that just don't make sense. They have no sense at all. Okay, you find out that physics doesn't know a thing about the origin, about the causality of all of the things that are most fundamental to physics. Now, they can take space and time and mass and say how they relate to each other, and they've got that to 25 decimal places. But when it comes to where do any of these things come from? Well, the answer is they just are. They're just there because they're there. Well, that's a real confession of I don't know. You know, I have no idea. And that should give physicists a hint. If you have no idea where your fundamentals come from, perhaps your perspective is wrong. You see, perhaps you're not looking at the problem just right. So it's interesting that the fundamentals in physics are unknowns, no cause. I thought everything had to have a cause in a material world. Well, everything does except the most fundamental things you have, and they don't have any cause. Well, that's a signature characteristic of a virtual reality. In a virtual reality, the computer just specifies things. If you make up a simulation, you make up quantities and give them attributes and properties. What's space? Well, space is, all you have to do is define an origin and, well, three-dimensional space anyway, and give three orthogonal unit vectors, pointing x, y, and z. That's space. You've just created space in your computer. And how do you expand that space? It's easy. You just put bigger numbers in the coordinates. You know, it's a simple thing. You don't worry about what is it expanding into and who's making the space. It's just real simple. Time is generated by the outer loop. It's a simulation. All dynamic simulations have an outer time loop. You do all your calculations about everything that changes, then you go back and increment time, one little bit, and then you calculate everything that changes, go back, increment time. There's this outer time loop that drives the simulation. That's where our time comes from. Our time tick-tocks here because in the simulation, we keep incrementing by delta t every time. There's the origin of time. Mass, charge, gravitation, those are concepts. They're models, okay? And we make up our concepts of those things to explain observed effects. This is stuff, you know, we see. We observe it, so we give it a name. And that's, you know, simulations are like that. When you simulate things, you get to make up the rule set. You get to make up, you know, how things relate to each other. So, okay, could a Sims character or a World of Warcraft elf discover the cause of their gravity or their time or mass or space? So if you're an elf, you could measure gravity. You could take a rock, you could go up on a cliff, throw it off, time, you know, how long it gets there, go up on a higher cliff, go down on a lower cliff, and if you did that experiment a few times, you could come up with a measurement of gravity. How strong is gravity in World of Warcraft? Well, things do fall down. If you let go of them in World of Warcraft, they drop and hit the ground, and that could be measured there. But could you find the cause of it? What could that elf do to discover the cause of that gravitation? Obviously nothing. The cause is the rule set, because it was programmed to have that gravity. That's where gravity comes from. It's a rule set. It's part of the rule set. And from inside, it's invisible to you. It just is. So when you have things like space, time, mass, charge, gravitation, and you just don't know where they come from, they just are, that's the signature of a virtual reality. That's how things have to be in a virtual reality, you see? So physicists looking at all these basics that don't have any definition, that just screams out virtual reality. That happens. That has to happen in all virtual realities. Okay, we only experience effects here, never more than the effects. We don't ever measure the thing behind the effect. And everything's like that. We make up stories to explain the effect. So we measure things. We see effects and we say, oh, that's because there was an electron. We never measure an electron. We only measure the effects of an electron or any other of these particles. Never the thing itself. The thing itself just is, you see. So when you're only measuring effects and you're making up a story, you're making up a model to explain your effects, the problem is then you start to believe in what you just made up. You start to believe in that story that you've made up to explain it. And then that's where you go wrong, because then double slit experiment comes up and says, oh, this electron's not really a hard little chunk of mass, you know, because it does some magic, it does miracles, it spreads itself around, it does other things, and hard little pieces of mass don't do that. Well, you're confused because you made up a model and you don't realize you just made it up. You really believe in these things you made up. You believe in electrons, and you're just terribly confused at why this little chunk of matter doesn't act like a little chunk of matter. Well, maybe it's because it never was. It's just your story, you see. So we never get to see behind the curtain. We only get effects out here, and we make up stories. There are no particles. Talk about particles all the way down. All those particles are just made up stories. None of those particles exist. Nobody's ever measured any of them, seen any of them. All they do is measure the effects of them and make up that particle as a model to explain their effects. So particles don't really exist. They're virtual particles, just like we have virtual bodies. See? So why do we make up things and then believe in them like that? Well, it's because that makes us feel better. It makes us feel more certain. It makes us feel like our world is fact-based. It makes us feel like materialism is right. It gives us a sense of understanding what's going on. To just say, well, we just measuring the effects, and we have no idea why, what's behind that effect. That's behind the curtain, and we can't see it. Too much uncertainty. Doesn't feel good. We need to come up with a better story that nails that down. We don't like living with uncertainty. Besides, it doesn't make us look smart when we don't know. So it's better to make up a word. Say, oh, that's because of electrons. So that's because of this. That's because of that. Where this charge? Oh, that comes from quarks. We can make up. It makes us sound really, really smart when we do that. But we're just making up stuff to explain the effects that we measure. And then we believe it. That's the problem. And scientists, this is kind of an interesting idea. Scientists needed to believe in materialism until our knowledge and understanding is advanced enough to give us a bigger picture and bigger explanation of how the world actually works. So you see, this materialism is a phase we're going through. We needed to believe that we're fact-based. Because if we're not fact-based, we don't know, we don't have solid ground under our feet. But we didn't have a bigger idea. So that was the idea that worked at the time. Okay? If that wasn't the case, if science didn't make these things up and believe in them, science would be a very different thing than it is now. Without the vast majority of people erroneously believing that science is a fact and it's fact-based, most people didn't believe that, and if they knew that it was really belief-based, religion may have had a more effective resistance in relinquishing control of being the high priests to the scientists. The scientists got to be the high priest because they had facts, and religion didn't. You see? And actually, the scientists didn't have any more facts than the religion did. But they appeared to. Their story was better. They had a more credible story. Okay? So it'd be a different world if that had been differently. All right, so let's go on here. More of these things. The speed of light. Of course, there is in every virtual reality has a maximum speed that things can move in that virtual reality. And that is 1 pixel or 1 chunk of volume per 1 increment of time. Every time you go around a time loop, you can move 1 spot. If you jump spots in 1 time loop, you're teleporting. Now you got a squirrely reality. If you need a reality that's something that you can experience in, 1 step, 1 time. That's as fast as you can move through any virtual reality. Well, the fact that C, for some magical reason that physicists can't understand, has this speed limit. And nothing can go any faster than C. Why is that? It's a really big mystery. It's a virtual reality. It goes with the territory. All virtual realities have a speed limit. So the fact that C is a constant, that's a given, you see. Again, it's a signature characteristic of a virtual reality. So this idea of, how do you know we're in a virtual reality? Well, you just open your eyes and look around. Your whole world is screaming that this is a virtual reality if you look at the details. It can't be anything else. Okay, there are no fields, only a rule set that calculates how things like electromagnetic and gravitational forces change and interact as a function of space and time. Okay, so we have that, but there really are no fields. The force field is a made-up fiction, just like the electron. Okay, I have a positive charge here. It's just sitting here, and I take another positive charge, and I put it here. What happens? This charge experiences a force, and this one too, pushing away each other, both positive charges. You'll let them go, they'll move this way. Well, that force is real. We can measure that. The fact that that force was delivered there to one charge to the other with an electric field, totally imaginary. There is no electric field, or magnetic field, or gravitational field. Fields are a mathematical abstraction that allows us to maintain a belief in materialism. We need a material cause to get this charge to affect that charge, because there's distance between them. How does it affect? There's nothing there. You know, it's like magic. This one just moves. Well, we don't like that. We want it to be materialistic. So we understand enough of the rule set to know that these two charges will move apart at a force that's proportional to the two charges and inversely proportional to the square of the distance that they're apart. So we know that. That's just part of the rule set. So we can compute what this force is going to be. But it's just a point in space. And the rule set says that, you know, in this, if you have one here and one here, that's what's going to happen. You'll have that force according to the rule set. There is no field that transmits that force. And yes, it does take a little time. When you just move this here, it'll be just a little bit of time before this one feels that force. Well, that's just a little delay. It's part of the rule set. The rule set's trying to make this look like a physical reality, you see, because that's what we're here for. So things like fields don't exist. And if you read science news, you know that we just saw the first gravitational wave about 6 months ago or so. Some big event happened, star blew up or something, and we measured what? Oh, they said in the newspapers, and what the scientists tell you, we measured a gravitational wave. First time ever, yay us. What they measured was a change in gravitational force. They had something that was sensitive to gravitational force, and they saw a little blip in that, and that's what they measured. The wave is entirely a fiction. Okay? It's unnecessary. It just makes us feel better about being materialists. We need that wave to make us feel like we're in charge. And this is a fact-based world. We understand everything. Another thing that's interesting I didn't tell you about the speed of light is that British scientists that are in charge of what here in this country I think is the what weights and measures. They're the science group, mostly physicists, that keep track on, you know, how long is a meter, how much does a gram weigh and things like that. And one of the other things they keep track of is speed of light. And it has been reported that the speed of light doesn't seem to stay constant. It moves around a little bit. Not much, but more than the error in the measurements would indicate. For every measurement comes with a little arrow, but this is a bigger motion than the errors in the measurements. And it's not only done it once, it's done it 3 or 4 times, where the speed of light used to be this speed, and it was like that, you know, from the first measurements, and here's their error bars, and now it's different, bigger than the error bars. Then it stays like that for a while, and then it's different. And then maybe it goes back up again. And it's like, what's up with that? Well, if you're in a virtual reality, physicists don't talk about that because there's no answer for that. It's another one of these, have no idea. Well, as when you have a virtual reality, you don't compute it to any more level of resolution than you have to, right? You're not going to do World of Warcraft down to nanoseconds or, nanometers. It doesn't make any sense. You don't need that kind of accuracy. Well, you only need so much accuracy here until physicists start doing things like smashing atoms and, double slit experiments and other stuff that starts to get down into the details of things. And then guess what? You need a little more resolution. Well, what do you do if you need resolution? Well, you don't want to change. The resolution that you get has to do with that delta T, right, and that delta volume. Well, take the cube root of a delta volume and you get a delta length. So we have a pixel, if you will, a pixel width, and you have a delta T. All right, what's the maximum speed? Well, it's the delta X over the delta T. 1 delta X, 1 delta T. That's speed of light here. Well, now we need more resolution. We don't want to change the speed of light because a whole lot of things depend on that, right? So what are we going to do? Well, we can, it's a fraction. You could divide the numerator, the delta x, by 1,000,000. You could divide the delta t by 1,000,000. You get the same ratio. Speed of light stays the same. Oh, except these are digital. It's delta t and delta x. You can't just come up with any number you want. They only change by little increments. And when you've changed it, you can't line them up exactly the way it was to, speed of light, 18, 20 decimal places, 30, whatever we've measured. You can't line them up that good because you can't precisely reduce them by exactly the amounts you need to keep that ratio constant. So what happens is, as we need more resolution gets added, but out in the 10th decimal place, it's off a little bit. And this is what they're seeing. And I have not looked at this, but it would be my prediction that you'd find these little changes in the speed of light come just before we dig deeper into the resolution of our physical reality, so that they represent changes in the resolution here, trying to keep the ratio the same, but not being able to keep it exactly the same because the things are digital. They have to move by a whole chunk. They can't move by half a chunk or 6.5 chunks or something. It has to move by exactly a whole chunk, so you can't keep the ratio the same. So that would explain that. So we see that these initial conditions without a cause, right? When a virtual reality starts with initial conditions and a rule set. Well, did we start with initial conditions? What's the Big Bang? It's an initial condition. Why? Where did it come from? How did that little ball of plasma get there under that high temperature and pressure? Because our universe didn't exist yet. So it obviously didn't come out of our universe, and if our universe is all there is, that's all the reality there is our universe, right? That's standard catechism for science. Then where did that ball of plasma come from? What happened before the Big Bang, and who put that there, and how did it get there, and so on? Of course, totally unanswerable. Why? Because it was an initial condition. That's what we started with. Well, when you have a reality that starts with initial condition and no cause, that's the signature of a virtual reality. See? The chaos that we find, that's the signature of a virtual reality. All virtual realities will have chaos if they push their parameters, because it's just a natural thing. Quantum mechanics, the double slit experiment, it's a signature of a virtual reality. It's certainly not the signature of a materialistic reality. It's the signature of a virtual reality. You have these odd things that happen. Not knowing where mass and time and space and all that stuff comes from is a signature of a virtual reality. So these are the kinds of things that give me some confidence that this is a virtual reality. It answers all the questions, you see, all the big paradigms. Okay, now it's time for the break. But come right back. Don't tarry too long because we got a lot to cover yet.